more beautiful. I'm trying to give you space to see the virtual picture, so we need to get new pictures to put up behind us for the virtual programs. But we are glad that you are here with us this evening virtually for a talk with Dr. Joseph L. Graves, and I'll introduce him in a moment. But if you are new to the Athenaeum and are intrigued by what you see behind me, by the conversation that we have tonight, which should not just be the conversation or the lecture by our guest, but also the conversation that we have together with him after his talk. I hope you'll find that we are a lively and vibrant community of people who love to learn, who find that we grow in every which way by learning, who care about history and the built environment, who care about art and literature and music, who care about all things Philadelphia and how we interact with our world and the world beyond. So welcome, and if you are interested, please look on our website, come in and see our beautiful space where you can check out books and come to programs and even more, and become a member. We'd love to have you as a member. But right now, I would like to introduce you to our guest speaker tonight. Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr. is a professor of biological sciences at the Department of Biology at North Carolina A&T State University, which is the largest public HBCU, historically Black college or university in the country. He's also the first African-American to receive a PhD in evolutionary biology. And I think during his talk or during the questions, he can tell us a little bit more about what that means. He was also elected a fellow of the Council of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 1994. He's an associate director of the Triangle Center for Evolutionary Medicine and has recently been added to the board of the National Center for Science Education, with his term beginning in 2021. And he's coming to us this evening from Greensboro, North Carolina. So I invite you to join me tonight in welcoming Dr. Joseph Graves to the Athenaeum.
Well, thank you for the gracious introduction. I'm going to share my screen now and get this show on the road. So the title of tonight's talk is Voice in the Wilderness. A pioneering biologist explains how evolution can help us solve our biggest problems. It's based upon the book of the same name, which came out in the fall of 2022. The purpose of my writing this work was to acquaint readers with my pioneering journey as the world's first African-American evolutionary biologist. Some of you may wonder, why, and I'll sort of get to that in the course of tonight's conversation. The book really is organized in two parts. Part one, The Unexpected Path, is more autobiographic, focuses on my early life, education, the first significant scientific problems that I tackled, things like lakes and rivers, parasitology, community ecology, chaos theory, evolution, and the physiology of aging. Part two is really a discussion of the scientist I became and the problems that I thought were the most significant. So it focuses on how evolution can help us solve our biggest problem, my fight with scientific racism, how we can have meaningful conversations between science and religion, my primary research in the genomics of adaptation, and also the role that science can and should play in helping us bring about social justice. Now, I was born 4 months before Emmett Till was lynched in Money, Mississippi. Now, I don't know the age distribution of those of you listening, but growing up in naked Jim Crow white supremacy was an experience. My children don't have any idea of what that was like. But as a young child, I rapidly came to understand that I was not really a full person in this society. One of the first experiences that brought that home for me was traveling south to visit my grandparents, who had a small farm in Brunswick County, Virginia. So I remember, as a 5-6-year-old kid, my mother, who worked as the help during the day and then worked a factory job at night, coming home and going to work frying chicken for the trip. And I would go, Mom, why are you doing that? You should get some sleep. We have to leave early tomorrow. And, if you knew my mother, she was one of the sweetest people that ever walked this earth. She would just look at me and smile and say, baby, go to bed. It was only when I was an adult that I realized that the reason my mother stayed up all night cooking chicken for us for the ride to Brunswick County was that once we passed into Maryland, we would not be served at any restaurant along the highway. We didn't have a green book because my parents had very little education. All they knew was that anytime we stopped for gas, it could be a problem once we crossed the Mason-Dixon line. So, I met my grandparents, I worked in the fields, pulled tobacco, just like they did during slavery days, went to town and was Jim Crowed at the ice cream parlor. I couldn't have been more than 6 years old. I went back to an education system that wasn't designed for me either. During that time, tracking was the standard way that children were educated. They made decisions about people based upon their socioeconomic status and their socially defined race. So it wasn't hard for me to understand why all of the African-American kids were all in the same class. And the materials that I was given to work with, I finished in a snap. So what do you think happens to a 5-6-year-old little boy who's done with his work, right? And, can't sit still. So immediately I decided I was going to be an airplane one day, and got up and decided to fly around the class. Well, that didn't go over well with the teacher. And I ended up in the principal's office. But then what happened after that was an attempt to assign me to special education because they thought that I was mentally retarded. Now, in the text, I tell the story again of my mother's heroism because, she went down to the school and she took on the principal and teachers and said, there's no way that you're putting my son in special education. There's nothing wrong with him. And she stood by it and she stood her ground. But in the text, I talk about a kid that this was done to in the 1990s. And his mom didn't have the means that my mother had to defend her child. And that's exactly what they did. They took him out of regular education and put him in special education. And he then began to behave in the way that the children who had learning disabilities behaved. And eventually he became exactly what they wanted him to be. And he dropped out of school and never finished. So that's why I call this the unexpected path. No one in my immediate family had gone beyond elementary school. And even that in Jim Crow didn't really mean much. My father could barely read. And none of my cousins had at that time had yet gone to college. So I also talk about a fateful encounter when I was in 3rd grade, actually 2 of them. I walked into school one day and there were some older kids on the steps playing chess. And I didn't know anything about it, the game. I'd never seen it before. And of course, being younger, I badgered them to teach me how to play. You know, teach me, teach me, teach me, teach me, teach me. And they're like, get out of here, kid. Leave us alone. Leave us alone. So finally, one of them takes the time to show me how the pieces move. And I start a game and he beats me really badly. So during library time, I went to the library and I went to the games section and I looked up a couple of books on how to play chess. One of them written by then American champion Bobby Fischer. Okay, and the nice thing about Fischer's book is that it didn't require that you know how to read chess notation. It just worked with diagrams. So I stayed up all night in my room with my flashlight under the covers, working through the book, and I went to school the next day looking for those kids again. And this time when I played, I demolished them. And by the time I was in 6th grade, I was school champion. By the time I was in 9th grade, I was middle school champion. By the time I got to high school, and this picture is from our high school yearbook in 1973, I was 3rd board on one of the strongest chess teams in America, high school teams. We finished 1st in New Jersey, 5th on the East Coast, and we went to the National High School Championship in Chicago that year. Going into the last round, we were tied for 4th place. Now, just to make a quick or long story short, we were all paired up against really, really high-rated players. And so within minutes, you know, usually chess games go for hours, but within minutes, all 3 of the other members of my team had lost, and I was the only person still playing. And 2.5 hours later, our game was the only game left in the entire national championship. To give you a sense of the drama, the player I was playing was from Rochester, New York. If he won, Rochester take the national title. Okay. We were surrounded literally by people cheering for Rochester and people cheering for Evanston, Illinois. If I drew or won, Evanston would win the championship. So late in the game, I decided to play for a win, and I sacrificed one of my heavy pieces, the rook, for a bishop and 2 pawns. When I made that move, you could see the look on the Rochester crowd. They could see victory in their hands because they thought that my sacrifice was unsound. But as the game continued, you could see the room shifting to the people in Evanston now smiling from ear to ear because the Rochester player was doomed. All he could do was sacrifice the material back. The game ended in a draw, and Evanston won the national title. Needless to say, I made a lot of friends from Evanston, Illinois that day. Chess was the game that gave me and taught me the ability to do the deep critical thinking that helps one become a scientist. Now, I'm skipping over my undergraduate years because, quite frankly, I wasn't really that good in undergraduate. I went to Oberlin College, you know, one of the nation's premier liberal arts colleges, and I had to get a scholarship to go because my parents couldn't pay for me to go to college. And so, knowing nothing about, you know, college and college applications, I applied to 3 schools: MIT, Lafayette in Pennsylvania, and Oberlin. So I got my first letter back. It was a rejection from MIT. I wasn't that upset because I didn't really like the place anyway. I got my second letter back, And I was on the waiting list at Lafayette. And now I was really beginning to get nervous. And so the next day, the third letter came. It was an acceptance to go to Oberlin College with a combination of scholarships and work study. I literally ran downtown to the post office, bought a stamp, signed a letter, put it in the mail. My parents didn't even see it. And that's how I ended up at Oberlin College. Okay, I was pretty bright, but not really focused on school that much. And also the way undergraduate science was taught really didn't bring out my skills, so it was when I became a graduate student that the capacity to formulate questions and work through how you test those hypotheses really sort of, differentiated me from everyone else around me. Now, when I went to the University of Michigan in my memory is like, I went to Michigan in 1979. It's my first year on campus. There were only 5 African-American graduate students in the science at an institution of over 50,000 students and close to 9,000 graduate students. So there were only 5 of us. It was assumed by many that the only reason that we were on the campus was to fill affirmative action quotas. And when you hear that enough, you begin to believe it. Of course, I had heard a lot of that as an undergraduate. Until one day, one of the professors pulled me aside and said, Joe, you really shouldn't believe that, because you received the highest scores on quantitative and analytical reasoning of any student that we admitted into the graduate program this year. That helped. And I got interested in topics like the mathematics of complex systems. But it was at Michigan where I began to really understand that the problem wasn't me. It was a system of structural racism and white supremacy. Up until this point in my life, when I had failings, I had internalized them and I believed to the heart that I had done something wrong, that I wasn't good enough. Okay. One of my professors and one of the folks that I dedicated one of my last books to helped me understand that no, there is this insidious system that doesn't want people like me to be able to make contributions and to move forward in society. And when I began to see that, I also began to recognize that I was as good as anybody on the campus. So when I got involved in student activism, it led to me basically flunking out of Michigan. So I got a nicely worded letter from the graduate school saying, you're out of here. I walked away. I spent some years, which I describe in the book, doing revolutionary organizing in Detroit, working in the auto factories, working in the service sector, organizing against racial terror. But at the end of the day, I was still extremely poor. By that time, I was married. I was concerned about the future of having a family. And I decided on one cold, snowy day in Detroit to drive down to Wayne State University and submit my application to finish my PhD. So as the story goes, again, not spending too much, taking out too much out of the text, the graduate officer took one look at me and said, well, you do know that this is a very prestigious institution and department. And I said to him, yes, Dr. Moore, that is precisely why I want to be a student here. I handed him my CV He took one look at it, his jaw dropped. He started dialing the phone, and he called up Professor Leo Luckenbill and said, "I've got a student here you need to meet." And so during these years, I faced down imposter syndrome. And I can't really say that I was Black Darwin yet, but I was really well on the way. This is a picture from my dissertation day. Leo Luckenbill is on what would be, I guess, your right. My wife, Sue, is in the middle, and I think you recognize that that young man was me. So, but this wasn't done without travail either, because before I could overcome imposter syndrome, I needed someone to tell me that that was my problem. And so one day, the best thing that Leo did for me in terms of my training is he called me into his office and he said, "Look, Joe, everybody knows that you are a really smart guy. But if you don't get in the laboratory tomorrow and start working on your dissertation, I am going to let you go." And that night, I had to make a decision. And I also had to decide on doing a project. So I invented my research PhD project that evening. And the next day I started the experiments. And the rest, they say, is history. And that work led to contributed to one of the greatest scientific revolutions of the 20th century. And specifically, what I'm talking about is what Peter Medawar described in 1952 as an unsolved problem in biology. One that you would think biologists would have figured out. Darwin had some ideas about this. His collaborator, Alfred Russel Wallace, had deeper ideas about it, but they didn't get it right either. And that was the question, why do organisms age? It's one of these things that people take for granted. They look at animals, they look at plants, they go through various life history stages, and then they begin to age and eventually die. But why that happens was never the focus. So even in the 1980s, geneticists thought that aging was a non-genetic phenomenon. And so when our group began to work on this problem, we employed evolutionary theory to ask the question, why should organisms age? And quite frankly, really couldn't come up with an answer. And that led first Michael Rose, who would later become my postdoctoral advisor, and Leo Luckenbill to start experiments to test Peter Medawar's idea. And Medawar thought that the force of natural selection declined with the age of adult organisms because, quite frankly, if you don't reproduce early, it doesn't matter whether your genes do bad things later in your life. And so Michael's experiment, followed by Leo's, demonstrated that if you change the timing of reproduction, you change the lifespan of the organism. And they demonstrated that this was under genetic control. Now, some of you are probably wondering, well, why didn't they get the Nobel Prize for this? And it turns out that evolutionary biology was not eligible for the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology. The first Nobel Prize in that area to an evolutionary biologist occurred this year, to Svante Pääbo, who introduced the field of paleogenomics. So at this time, and this was in the mid-1980s, they weren't going to give a prize, even though this is one of the most important scientific problems solved by evolutionary biologists. Now, it turned out that one of my professors at Michigan, William D. Hamilton, who created the theory which made our experiments work, did get the Japan Prize for that, which is the Japanese equivalent of the Nobel. But years later, when we have more sophisticated tools like the ability to sequence whole genomes, like in this paper with my colleagues that I published in Molecular Biology and Evolution in 2017, we use those same ideas that we developed in the 80s to be able to show the genomic foundations of this differentiation in lifespan, further demonstrating that genes definitely play a role, and specifically what types of genes are involved. Now, you might say, well, Dr. Graves, well, this only works for fruit flies, so why is that important to humans? Well, it turns out that the same genetic mechanisms that operate in the fruit fly, and the reason why the fruit fly was chosen for these seminal experiments, are the ones which operate in humans. So on Friday, I have a piece coming out in the blog Culture Rico, further explaining how this theory applies to human aging. So there are basically two mechanisms involved. Okay, the first is called mutation accumulation. And basically what this says is that if a gene has no impact on early life survival and reproduction, it will not contribute to aging. I'm sorry, backwards. It will contribute to aging, but it doesn't harm you during your reproductive period. And so therefore, the frequency or the occurrence of these kinds of genes will be left up to chance. So examples of that are things like Alzheimer's disease and Huntington's chorea. They don't start their effect until late in life. And so if we look at groups of people around the world, the frequencies of Alzheimer's and Huntington's are like the result of rolling a dice. Some people have slightly higher amounts of it, some people have slightly lower, and you can't really predict who's going to get it. Whereas the second mechanism, antagonistic pleiotropy, is a case of where the genetic variant involved is actually beneficial to your early life survival and reproduction, despite its negative impact late in life. Now, a really good example of that is the disease that we call cancer. Because without the genetic sequences involved in predisposing individuals to cancer, we wouldn't be able to develop from a single-celled organism to a multicellular organism, nor would we be able to replace tissues that go through wear and tear. So you might notice that most cancers occur in things like the epithelium of the skin, the lung, and so on. These are tissues, blood cells that have to turn over rapidly, and so therefore the genes which allow that to happen are also the same ones that predispose you to having cancer. Now, the side of this that's more insidious is that because these genes are beneficial early in life, everyone has them. So while not everyone will die from cancer, everyone has the genes which predispose you to cancer. And quite frankly, if you live long enough, you would definitely die of cancer. But we in the Western world have produced so many other ways to die that not everyone dies from cancer. So now, another one of the themes in the book is how evolution helps us understand how we should be living as societies. So there's a great danger to the future of our species if we allow systems of social injustice to govern the world. Now, if you're familiar with the history of evolutionary thought, you might think that evolutionary biologists wouldn't say that. I mean, for example, people often confuse Herbert Spencer and the term social Darwinism with evolutionary biology. And that's absolutely incorrect. Herbert Spencer's ideas were a grab bag of various ideological positions that really had nothing to do with evolution by the means of natural selection. In fact, Charles Darwin knew Herbert Spencer and thought the guy was an idiot. But his ideas became very popular in the Western world, along with Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton, and people incorrectly associate these other ideas with the ideas that evolutionary biologists produced. So I'm often asked this question, and this takes great significance in the light of the current controversies circling the nation about what can and cannot be taught with regards to American history. Should we teach about the history of racism and eugenics? And as I've just pointed out, the field of evolutionary biology has deeply problematic history in supporting racism and eugenics. So I've been asked, should we discuss and address that history in our college courses? And if so, how and in which classes and how early in students' college education? So I say, yes, we should be discussing it, because this subject is literally a gold mine of logical fallacies that can be utilized to teach students about the enterprise of science. And I differentiate the enterprise of science from scientific reasoning. They are not the same thing. Scientific reasoning is this method which you all know. It's observation, it's hypothesis, it's experimentation. Okay, but then there's the enterprise of science. What do you use those results for? And who benefits from what you're doing? So, the enterprise is full of villains and heroes who have addressed this question, particularly the significance and meaning of human biological diversity. So I was first drawn into this in 1994. Now, at this time, I'm a Drosophila evolutionary geneticist. I'm doing experiments about life history, evolution, and aging. But I received a call in my office from a sociologist colleague of mine, Dr. Ben Bowser. And he asked me, have you heard of this new book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life? I didn't know anything about it. So he implored me to write a reply to the genetic and statistical claims in this book. Now, I want you to point out that I was in a particular important position relative to the reception of this work. So you had people like a couple of my idols, like Stephen Jay Gould, who I'd met when I was a grad student, and Richard Lewontin, who was pictured in the last slide, talking about what was wrong with this book. But they were talking to an audience that wasn't the audience that was going to listen to me. As the first African-American evolutionary biologist, I was in a unique position to critique this book. So a lot of folks just, ran out the flag. Well, it's racist, it's racist, it's racist. Well, that doesn't explain anything. So instead of running up the flag and saying, oh yeah, these guys are a bunch of racists, I took the time to actually read the thing cover to cover. And so my first paper on this was entitled Race and IQ Revisited. Figures never lie, but often liars figure. And this was making the point that there's data here that can't be ignored. For example, they presented the IQ distribution for people socially defined as Black and white over the 20th century. Okay, from a variety of psychometric tests. And the data is clear. The white distribution is to the right of the Black distribution. And you can say, oh, well, IQ tests are racist. Well, that may be, but this data needs an explanation other than IQ tests are racist. So in these two pieces, okay, I go into, exactly what their assumptions were, what their claims were, how their math was completely wrong, and their genetic assumptions were fallacies. So for this time, I'm professor at Arizona State, and as you can see, headline in Valiant State is bell curve conclusions berated by ASU geneticists. And yeah, I went very hard on these because this stuff was absolute nonsense. But despite the fact that scientifically it was nonsense, it was featured on the cover of Time and Newsweek. Larry Sanders, then president of Rutgers University, suggested Blacks might not have the genetic potential to succeed in higher education. Okay, and so on. What I showed is that there is absolutely no reason to believe this stuff because the methods were shoddy. The assumptions were wrong. The claims made overblown. And so I took the time to go through this and address it in ways that other people, particularly other African-American scholars, could not. Now, this began to get me thinking about why and how people still thought racially in our society. So I realized I needed to do a full-length discussion of what was wrong with this way of thinking. And that led me to writing The Emperor's New Clothes, which was first published in 2001, Biological Theories of Race in the Millennium. This book was a history of racial thinking in the Western world, how it came to be, and less, some of it, what's wrong with it. I did more of that in the sequel, The Race Myth, why we pretend race exists in America. Now, to say the least, The Emperor's New Clothes is still my most cited publication. So if you go on Google Scholar, you look me up, The Emperor's New Clothes is way above all of my other publications. Even though originally they had this book listed as a work of sociology, despite the fact that the title says Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium. Amazing how that works. But and so much of my career then took on a new avenue of scholarship because this stuff wasn't going away. No matter how much science was being done on human biological variation, by the time we're in the 2000s, we now have the ability to sequence the human genome and get resolution concerning, population genetic variation at levels we never had before. And despite all of this, people are still believing this racist nonsense. And so my good colleague, Alan Goodman, called me up in 2019 while Trump was still in the White House and said, Joe, we really need to write a book where we answer all of these misconceptions that people still hold about human biological variation and race. And that led to Racism, Not Race, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. And I honestly hope I never have to write another book about race, but unfortunately, I feel I probably will. So I'm going to skip this slide because this is told about in the book, and I want to actually get to the point where we actually talk about this stuff. So one of the things that I charged myself with doing, okay, is changing the face of research in evolution and genetics. What you're seeing here is my research group from the summer of 2018. This group is tiered from undergraduates all the way up to assistant professors. And I mentored all these people in different ways. Assistant professors on how to make tenure. Okay, postdoctoral researchers on how to become assistant professors. Graduate students on how to become postdoctoral researchers. Undergraduate students about how to go in a career in biology. High school teachers about how to present modern science in their classroom. And I can tell you, you would never have seen a group like this before at a meeting in this discipline. So most of that work is now focused on bacteria, particularly how bacteria evolved resistance to novel nanomaterials and ionic metals. These are some of the results from one of our recent papers. Again, if you want to ask me about this stuff, I will tell you about it. Utilizing new tools in genomics like gene expression, where we're able to look at how these bacteria regulate their resistance to these toxic materials by up and down regulating specific genes involved in the metabolism of these materials. Okay. And finally, okay, I haven't quit this because I think this is one of the most important things I've ever done. We are all born into various systems of social injustice. Some simply refuse to see this fact. Others resign themselves to accepting this and surviving the best way they can. And then still fewer try changing this. So a little earlier or late last year, I was asked to comment on the Supreme Court being asked to review Grudinger versus Bollinger, which is essentially the decision that supports affirmative action in higher education. So this article appeared in Scientific American, and my quote was this: should the Supreme Court overturn Grudinger versus Bollinger, thus essentially ending affirmative action at historically white institutions of higher education, they must simultaneously order that all states who violated the 1879 Plessy versus Ferguson decision by siphoning funds away from Black education to support white education must immediately pay those pilfered funds into Black public school districts and historically Black colleges and universities. Furthermore, they must order that going forward, a moonshot level investment in the infrastructure of HBCU, HSI, and MSI and tribal colleges must be put in place to meet the need for equitable education for non-whites in the United States. Now, I say this because in the short time I've been at North Carolina A&T, I've been able to make tremendous change with regard to the acquisition of terminal degrees, I mean PhDs in science. The thing that limits me in doing this and that of my colleagues is our infrastructure. It is really that simple. If I had the money that North Carolina State has, that UNC Chapel Hill has, we would transform the demography of higher education in a very short period. This is what's holding us back, historical underfunding. And just to let you know, we know exactly how much the state of North Carolina owes us. It's on the order of $1.3 billion. If I had that $1.3 billion today, we might not be having this conversation about underrepresentation in science. So I'm going to end my comments here, and I am happy to take on any questions from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Graves. I invite you all to you can put either in the chat or the Q&A, any questions you have. And while we're waiting, Dr. Graves, I'd love it if you could share a little bit about Premier. I think people can see on the top right-hand corner of your screen, the precision microbiome engineering. And I think this is kind of exciting news.
Yeah, this is great. So precision microbiome engineering is a consortium focused on being able to alter in a scientific way the microbiomes of the built environment. The partners are Duke University, North Carolina State, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, UNC Charlotte, and North Carolina A&T. This is an engineering research center of excellence, which is one of the largest awards that the National Science Foundation gives. The first 5 years is $26 million supporting research. And then unless we completely mess up, we should get another 5 years with another 26 million, bringing the entire award to 52 million over 10 years.
That's just that's just amazing.
Yeah, well, we keep working.
Yeah. We have a quiet group tonight. Sometimes people are, I've got the
Surprised.
questions.
I'm totally surprised, given what I just said, that everybody's quiet.
Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to type those questions in. So Rebecca is wondering if you could refresh our memories of the argument for ending affirmative action and the logic between that argument and funding HBCs, CUs.
Okay. So the argument for ending affirmative action basically stems from it's unfair to differentially treat racially subordinated people compared to persons of European descent in the present because of crimes committed by our society in the past. And so there's been a series of cases starting in the 1990s where affirmative action programs were mischaracterized as quota systems, as in the Bakke case. But throughout those challenges, the Supreme Court has held that affirmative action can be supported because it fulfills a greater social good, and that is diversifying the people receiving terminal degrees and in important professions like science and medicine, law, and so forth. However, if you haven't noticed, this country has swung violently to the right in its political orientation. I am very sure that this Supreme Court will overturn affirmative action. And therefore, if they do that, they should remember the history of their rulings concerning race in the United States. In 1879, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision was premised on the idea that segregation was okay so long as the facilities and services for the different racial groups were funded equally. Now, all of the former Confederate states found ways to subvert the intention of Plessy versus Ferguson. They underfunded, particularly Black education in the South, continuously until the Civil Rights Movement and the desegregation of higher education, which, for example, in North Carolina, doesn't really happen until the 1970s. So even though the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, there was no real desegregation of North Carolina universities until the mid-1970s. So my argument is if you're going to strike down affirmative action, then you should force these states to uphold the 1879 decision and repay the money that was stolen.
Maureen wonders your thoughts on Charles Darwin.
My thoughts on Charles Darwin. Darwin was, and most people, don't really know much about him. They make all sorts of assumptions about who he was and what he did. So Charles Darwin was born in an upper, landed gentry family. His maternal grandfather was Josiah Wedgwood, when you might recognize it, Wedgwood, China. But Josiah Wedgwood was one of the founders of the British Anti-Slavery Society and designed the British Anti-Slavery Medal. Charles' aunts were anti-slavery activists. So he was raised in a home and in a family that was opposed to slavery. Those views influenced how he thought about human biological variation. So much so that when he was going to publish on the origin of species for the first time, he intentionally did not include a discussion of human races. And the reason he did not was because he was afraid of the pushback that was going to come from Victorian society and European scientists about humans sharing common descent. At that time, and I talk about this a little in Voice, but much more in The Emperor's New Clothes, at that time, the predominant, quote, scientific view was a special creationist view that human races had resulted from separate creations of different pairs of Adam and Eve's. And so the Europeans were the offspring, the descendants of the Adam and Eve described in Genesis. All of the other races in the world were the descendants of the so-called pre-Adamite races. And so Darwin, was actually politically progressive for his time period. You can see that in his correspondence when he talks about race, racism, the Civil War, and so on. Now, was his science absolutely correct? And the answer is no. There were lots of things that Darwin didn't know, and there were lots of things that Darwin got wrong. But the field of evolutionary biology went forward with Charles Darwin as its founder, along with people like Alfred Russel Wallace. So I don't know if that answers the question or not.
So here's one going to your early research. I'm wondering, Caroline is wondering if the explanation you gave of why organisms age also explain why organisms die.
No, it doesn't. Okay, there are all sorts of ways you can die. And in fact, it's that extrinsic mortality that drives Medawar's explanation. And essentially, because you can die from all these other ways, like getting hit by a bus, or skydiving and your parachute doesn't open, or going swimming and you're eaten by a shark. And when our ancestors prowled the plains of the Olduvai, getting eaten by lions and leopards. All of these external sources of mortality mean that organisms are much better off investing their energy in reproduction than in mechanisms to try to keep them from aging. And that sets up a fundamental trade-off. Energy that is invested in reproduction is not invested in somatic maintenance. So therefore, genes that do crazy stuff after humans have stopped reproducing accumulate in our genome and cause progressive physiological dysregulation until we die.
Which we all do.
Yeah.
Yes.
But here's the flip side. Because we understand that, real treatments for various symptoms of aging are now on the horizon. Now, probably not in my lifetime, and some of these things already exist. For example, things like retinol creams, which improve skin tone across age. That's an anti-aging product, which is comes from understanding our idea. But there are things that are going to be far more foundational and fundamental coming down the pipe. And this will be something that younger people here will definitely see.
Well, I think there's 3 more questions I hope we can get to. One is from Conrad, wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you debunked the racist conclusion of the Bell Curve book.
Well, it starts with first, humans don't have biological races. So that's the first thing. So the people that Herrnstein and Murray are calling black and white are actually descendants of various human populations with various amounts of ancestry in different portions of the globe. So second, intelligence itself is an extremely difficult trait to define. There's still no agreement amongst professional psychologists about what intelligence actually is. That makes it extremely difficult to work towards understanding its genomic foundation if you don't actually know. So I'll give you a contrast. We can do a really good job of measuring people's height. You just get out a tape measure. But height is determined by close to 70% of the genes in our genome. And the major effects on height are probably around 100 genes contributing to individuals' height. Okay. And it's extremely heritable, meaning, if your parents are tall, you're going to be tall. If your, parents are short, you're likely to be short. Now, intelligence, on the other hand, uses at least 82% of the human genome. Okay. It is nowhere near as inheritable as height is. And, in terms of, studies that have actually tried to look at the heritability of intelligence. One of the most recent studies is a 1.2 million person study out of the UK. And this is one that Paige Harden, harps on in her book. It only explains 7% of the variation of intelligence. In other words, genetic effects explained 7% of the variation in intelligence, and only 11% of the variation in educational attainment, which means that 93% of the effect of on intelligence is unexplained by genetics. Okay, and 89% unexplained for educational attainment. Now, furthermore, when we look at these genomic variants that are supposedly associated with intelligence, and now these are all things I didn't know, by the way, when I wrote those articles, but I know this now because we actually could sequence the whole human genome. So when we look at, these genetic variants, they're not differentiated between human groups. So if you're claiming, there's a genetic basis to whites having greater intelligence than blacks, then you would be able to show using genome-wide association that these whites, whoever these folks are, have all these genes that make them more intelligent. But we can't show that. No study's ever shown that. And finally, the biggest flaw in the idea that genetic differences exist between human groups is the idea that natural selection would have acted on the genes which control intelligence in different ways in different groups. In other words, please name me the group of people who wouldn't have benefited from being a little smarter. I can't. So one theory was the winter selection theory, meaning somehow, experiencing winter made you smarter. So in other words, rainy season in the tropics doesn't make you smarter, only winter in the temperate zone. Another one was a life history theory by J. Philippe Rushton. And you can see my debate with Rushton on YouTube. And Rushton got the theory backwards. So using Rushton's theory, it would have been Africans with the greater genes for intelligence and Europeans who would have had less. So all of these attempts to explain how natural selection makes one group of people smarter than another all fall on their face. So at the end of the day, there is no scientific support for this idea. On the other hand, there's all sorts of science explaining how poor environment leads to poor academic success and poor cognitive function. Kids that have lead in their blood, their brains don't work as well as kids that don't have lead in their blood. In America, African-American children have 8 times the level of blood lead as European-American children do. So I can go on and on. Nutrition, kids that eat in the morning do better than kids that don't eat in the morning, and so on. So I don't need to look for, 137 genetic SNPs that differentiate intelligence when there are so many other easily explainable mechanisms at work.
Thank you. I think I maybe get a quick response to a meaty question from Carol. What are a couple of things that we can do as individuals and community members to improve our friends and family members' awareness of the insights that are gained from your work?
Well, I've been doing a lot of talks, a lot of podcasts. The book itself is a good thing to read. And for race, Alan, our work, Racism Not Race, and again, I'm one of the authors, but it is really one of the best books that explains all of these racial fallacies and why they are wrong, and provides people with tools that they can use to teach about this in their communities. And we wrote it for people who weren't scientists, for regular old folks, so that they could have these conversations. And quite frankly, I'm going to say this, and I'm not doing this to insult anyone, but there is only one reason that structural racism still exists in America. And that is because not enough people of European descent have stood up against it. And that is the only reason. Because if they did, then we would have changed this system a long time ago.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to a lot of thank yous here. Make sure you buy the book on bookshop.org. We just have a quick yes or no question that so many of us want to know, including Elizabeth. Do you still play chess?
Of course I do. I'm, in terms of speed chess, I'm one of the top 1% speed chess players in the world. Now,
Wow.
that's saying a lot because there are a lot of chess players. So, but in tournaments, I have played grandmasters. I have played masters. In fact, one of my games during the time I was a grad student at Wayne State was against Grandmaster Robert Stone, who was Canadian national champion at the time. And I was within 1 second of beating him.
Wow.
Yeah. So I still play chess. I play now in the International Chess League with the Burlington Ambush. A couple of weeks ago, we played his team from Exeter, England, and kicked their behinds.
Wow. Well, I think we're gonna have to find some chess master in Philadelphia to come to the Athenaeum.
But, you know, if
our
you
chess
guys
table
want
and
to
play.
interview somebody who would be great, Maurice Ashley. He's a friend of mine. He is the first person of African descent to reach the title of international grandmaster.
That's not a bad idea for a talk, actually.
No.
You've actually seen him if you watch television. There's a Hennessy commercial about the Black Bear School of Chess. That's Maurice Ashley.
Wow. Okay. Well, Tess will be reaching out to you. But for now, I hope all of you, Tess has put both links to both Dr. Graves' most recent book and also Racism Not Race in the chat. So you can click on those links. They'll open up onto a separate page on your computer or your phone, wherever you are right now. So you can purchase those books afterwards. We do have them at the Athenaeum as well, if you want to check them out. And Dr. Graves, thank you so much for giving of yourself this evening to share with us about your history and about the work that you have done and continue to do. We really appreciate you spending the time with us.
Well, again, thank you for the invitation. It was a blast.
Well, thank you. And for all of you who want more Athenaeum, go to our events page at philathenaeum.com and you will find all the programs we have coming up, including Friday evening is a First Friday. So from 5 to 7, come on over and see our pop-up artist, Diane Vaughn, and see her beautiful, beautiful work displayed at the Athenaeum. Enjoy good company and good conversation. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Good night.
Night.